All right, welcome back. We are dealing with the last chapter in this first week of class. This is chapter 9, participation, campaigns, and elections. This is the first presentation. So let's jump in and see what we got here. Here are the major topics. I'm going to not read them off to you, so you can read yourself. You're adults, you can do that. And then here are the chapter goals. This is what we're hoping that you'll be able to do, having read the material and gone through the course exercises. All right, so let's jump in. So elections are the core of all democratic societies. Democratic nations like the United States allow citizens to choose among candidates who represent their interests in government. The story that starts this chapter are of two of the youngest elected politicians. Democrat David Morales was sworn into Rhode Island's House of Representatives on January 2021 when he was only 22 years old. He was born to Mexican immigrants in rural California. He earned college credits while in high school, earned a bachelor's degree in 2 years. Then he attended Brown University in Rhode Island, where he earned a master's degree in public affairs and decided to run for the state legislature on issues of housing, education, and healthcare. His campaign strategy involved reaching out to frequent voters, but also to first-time voters, working class and low-income Delawareans who often felt left out of the political process. So, I think that's an awesome story. He beat an incumbent, 6-year incumbent by 20 points. Republican Caleb Hanna knocked on a lot of doors like David Morales and won his campaign by commanding margins, and he won a seat in the West Virginia state legislature. Caleb was a 19-year-old college freshman when he was elected in 2018. He is still one of the youngest legislators and youngest black person ever to be elected to a state legislature. He became interested in politics in the 3rd grade when Barack Obama became the first black president of the United States. But he also blamed Obama's environmental policies for when his adoptive father, a coal miner, was laid off, and decided to register to vote as a Republican when he turned 18. He's a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. And again, what do these, these presentations are going to focus on how elections work and how electoral rules and other considerations influence campaign strategy and turnout. So, who participates and how? We're looking to describe the patterns of participation among major demographic groups. If you belong to a certain group, you are more likely, based on statistics, to support one party or the other. So, who participates and how? Political participation refers, again, to a broad range of activities, from voting to donating to campaigns, to walking neighborhoods, to participating in demonstrations and protests. Digital politics includes not only the exchange of information, but also new forms of fundraising and voter outreach and mobilization. These are all sort of important issues that are increasingly coming to the fore, that are happening virtually these days. Riots and protests are increasingly an unfortunate aspect of politics. Again, they're potentially more normal and spontaneous bases for political participation. The Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman wrote a book in the 1950s called Presentations of Self in Public, and he noted the extent to which mechanisms of social control create a social environment where normal relations tend to prevail over violence, which makes peaceful mechanisms of politics, particularly voting, the dominant form of political expression over violence. So in other words, we are habituated to be peaceful rather than violence, but we can also become habituated to violence, and that's something that we have to be very wary of. Most Americans reject violence and rioting for political ends, but again, peaceful dissent and protests are a First Amendment right. So civil rights protests and the anti-war protests that roiled American politics in the 1960s were largely accepted as kind of normal, acceptable forms of dissent. However, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020 provoked nationwide protests that often erupted in violence. The marches themselves were not violent, but oftentimes at night, even when there were curfews, there would be gangs of groups of people who, on the far left and the far right, who were looking for one another to engage in riot. Unfortunately, and that's sort of a phenomenon we have to be, again, very, very wary of. Political participation in elections. When asked what makes a good citizen, 3 in 4 Americans believe that voting is a critical element. A much smaller portion of Americans engage in additional forms of participation by contacting elected officials, attending campaign events, and volunteering to work on campaigns. Because greater levels of political engagement require greater levels of commitment, time, and resources, a much smaller percentage of Americans engage in those kinds of activities. Voting is the single most important political act in which most Americans engage. Until the 20th century, the suffrage was restricted to white males, and many states aggressively worked to restrict the franchise, the access to the right to vote. Several constitutional amendments, including the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and I believe the 26th Amendment, have greatly expanded access to voting. And then, of course, you also have the Voting Rights Act, which significantly expanded access to the ballot and did a great deal to prevent voter suppression, right? So again, the 24th Amendment also banned the use of poll taxes to restrict the franchise. And again, these are all, movements over the course of the 20th century have largely worked to expand the franchise. We are currently in a moment where we are, to some extent, restricting the franchise, unfortunately. Political participation. Again, this reflects the percentage of people who report participating in a particular activity. And again, voting is almost double what the second highest rated thing is, and that would be publicly expressing support for a campaign on social media, contacting an elected official. These are the only things that approach majority status. And again, when you look at people who actually attend rallies or who actually work or volunteer on a campaign, you're talking about single digits for the most part. Again, this is the voter turnout in presidential and midterm elections between 1892 and 2020. Again, midterm elections are much lower turnout events. Again, to some extent, in the 19th century, turnout was much higher, largely because, again, the franchise was highly restricted. As we have expanded the franchise to a larger number of people, that has at once again, cause some people to say, I don't want to do it, and then others, to cause other people to say, I don't want them to do it. There are reasons. I mean, to some extent, apathy and poverty are strongly correlated, and so that is one reason why we have Americans voting at much lower rates than other industrialized countries, but also you have the larger problem of people saying, I think my interests are harmed by that group of people voting, and so they use what power they have to make it harder for those folks to vote. Online political participation. The internet provides citizens with far greater access to information about candidates. The internet makes traditional forms of participation easier. Digital political participation include a wide range of activities, including discussing issues with candidates or mobilizing supporters through social media, email, and text messaging, reading online news stories and commenting on them, viewing YouTube videos and campaign ads, contributing money to candidates online, to candidates, parties, and groups, contacting political leaders and following them on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Online mobilization works effectively through emotional appeals, immediacy, and personal networks and social pressure. Social media tends to work in concentrated bursts. Again, Bernie Sanders relied heavily on Reddit to organize rallies and rock concerts on his behalf. Donald Trump's 2016 campaign likewise used Facebook and Twitter to expand his campaign's online footprint. But the question is online participation significant, or is it merely collectivism? And that refers to online participation that requires little effort and may not actually convert to offline acts of participation in politics, especially voting. A survey of 65,000 registered voters found that frequent social media users were more likely to vote for Trump than for any other candidate in 2016, which suggests that the clicks can add up. Again, here is America side by side, voter turnout in comparison. And again, if you look, we're down near the bottom. 45% is sort of the average of the voting age population. There are a variety of reasons for that. One, we don't require compulsory voting. Two, we don't make it easy, for example, either through holiday or weekend voting or automatic or compulsory registration. Many of those countries that have very high rates of participation generally do those things. Australia does all three. Their turnout rate is at 81%. And that, the reason for that is they make people do it to some extent. Now, the fines, for compulsory voting are relatively low, but again, people are rational maximizers, and they're going to say, I'd rather not pay a $15 fine than just go ahead and go and vote. Socioeconomic status and age. Again, the higher the socioeconomic status, the more likely you are to participate. Education is the single most important variable for predicting whether an individual not only will vote, but engage in other forms of participation. Higher income Americans disproportionately make contributions to candidates. Older Americans tend to participate at higher rates than younger Americans. Part of the reason for that is that they're worried about losing things like Social Security and Medicare. So to illustrate, in 2016, citizens over 65 reported the highest turnout at 71%. They turned out at the highest rate of all demographic groups, followed by those in the 45 to 66 age category at 67%. People 30 to 44 turned out at 58%, and people aged 18 to 29 turned out at 46%. And younger voters have a distressing tendency to vote at very low rates very low rates. Turnout in midterm elections are generally skewed even more heavily towards older Americans. And again, for a variety of reasons, older Americans tend to be a bit more conservative, which again gives, there is an advantage that comes from those people who show up and continue turning out even in midterm elections. So that's it for this presentation. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of campaigns, voting, and elections. I'll see you next time.